Hi, and welcome to Strategy Stuff. This is a video series on the strategy of protest and revolution, where we'll look at how successful revolutionary and protest movements have strategized to achieve their political goals. To do that, we'll be focusing on the following questions. First, how do activists turn public discontent into a political movement? Second, how do movements plan their action out to achieve their political goals? And third, how have successful strategies changed with time? Over this series, we'll answer these questions by looking at various historical movements. But before we do that, let's first structure our thinking by examining the basic elements within a strategy of protest and revolution. Protests and revolutions are both what sociologists call social movements. The key characteristic they share is collective action, where ordinary people band together to push political demands against establishment interests, which are usually backed by state power. Members of the establishment may lead a movement, but it is ordinary people who ultimately provide the driving force, and that's what differentiates social movements from coups, which are completely driven by members of the establishment. There are many ways to explain why a social movement succeeds, but since this is a strategy channel, we'll focus on the process of protest and revolution, looking at how movements took what they had and turned it into victory. At the most basic level, the social movement process takes the input of public participation and converts it into the output of political power. The establishment looks at that power and has two options. It can decide that it's not possible or worth it to match that power, leading to negotiation and compromise, or it can increase its own power to outmatch the movement, leading to suppression or, in the event of complete failure, a revolution. Either way, the more power a movement has, the higher its chances of success. So how can a movement increase its power? Looking again at the social movement process, we can see two ways to do so. We either increase the amount of input, or we increase the rate of conversion into output. In practical terms, this means we either get more of the public to participate, or we get our existing participants to contribute more political power. These two fundamental options form the skeleton of a social movement grand strategy. Movements don't have unlimited resources, so they have to make choices on what they will prioritize to maximize power. At the highest, most abstract level of grand strategy, movements look at the social movement process and choose whether they want to prioritize participation or prioritize contribution. This corresponds to the two basic elements within a social movement: issues and organization. Issues focus on participation. An issue is a problem and solution combo. The movement highlights a problem, proposes a solution, and sells the package to the public. Because issues are ideas, they can reach people who are normally beyond a movement's social or geographic environment. A good issue turns these people into participants, allowing a movement to rapidly gain scale and establish a large base of support that establishments will find hard to ignore. So what's a good issue? The best problems tend to be things that the public actually recognizes as a problem, and an urgent one at that. This combination usually only happens when there is some dramatic failure that focuses attention on the issue at hand. Examples could be the Stonewall riots for the US gay rights movement, or the Shah's violent suppression of religious students in the Iranian Revolution. A good solution is a bit more complicated. One hypothesis is that the public compares the movement's policy position with what the establishment is offering, which is usually the status quo. If the movement's solution isn't that different to the establishment position, people won't see enough benefit to overcome the costs of fighting the establishment. On the other hand, if there is too much change, people will also worry that the result will wipe out the benefits they do get from the status quo, and again, they won't join. So in the end, the most attractive solution is usually one that offers a moderate amount of change from the establishment position. This is, of course, not what ideological purists want to hear. But there are ways for them to win on issues. They can, for example, radicalize in phases like the French Revolution, shifting into major changes one moderate step at a time. Or they can frame their demands in moderate terms, Lenin's Land, Bread, and Peace instead of the Communist Manifesto. Cynical, perhaps, but in the end, it's all to maximize public participation, and that's what issues are all about. Let's now turn to organization, which focuses on the contribution part of the social movement process. The idea of contribution works like this. A movement can attract 1 million participants, but if all they do is give verbal support, then that's no real threat to the establishment. It's certainly less of a threat than 10,000 participants that reliably vote or strike or bomb if their demands are not met. So contribution is basically how much and how far participants will act for the movement. But action is inherently costly, whether in terms of sacrificing leisure time or facing down state suppression, and the average participant is generally not fanatical enough to bear this cost by themselves. Organization helps by pooling, coordinating, and distributing the collective resources that participants bring to the movement. Good organization lowers the cost of action, which increases the frequency and extent of action and, in the end, the power that the movement generates per participant. So what's good organization? As this video series will show, it depends on the circumstances. By themselves, top-down hierarchies with specializations and command structures tend to use resources more efficiently, especially compared with bottom-up networks of independent cells that duplicate processes and have to negotiate with each other to get things done. That's why movements in tolerant political environments tend to become bureaucracies, like European trade unions or the US National Rifle Association. But in an intolerant environment, centralization would expose the movement to a crippling leadership strike, and in any case, the establishment wouldn't have let the movement raise the resources to develop and maintain these expensive bureaucracies. There is also an ideological aspect to organization. Because bottom-up organizations have weak or no centralized leadership, decisions tend to reflect a more moderate and flexible ideology that represents the majority of participants, which is, of course, an ideologue's nightmare. One thing to remember in social movements is that activists don't just fight the establishment, they also fight each other, and that will be a recurring theme in this video series. So, we've seen how issues and organization influence the social movement process. Now, we'll use them to analyze the 3 stages of social movement grant strategy, each exemplified by a major historical revolution. The first stage is spontaneous uprising, exemplified by the French Revolution. This is a high-issue, low-organization grant strategy, where the movement positions itself on such a hot-button issue that the public spontaneously and massively rises up in an explosion of support. Because there is little organization, the movement doesn't have much control over how participants act. But if it works, it's a simple and cheap path to victory. The second stage is mass agitation, exemplified by the Russian Bolshevik Revolution. This is a medium-issue, medium-organization grant strategy, where there is general discontent, but the public isn't motivated or organized enough to deliver victory on the movement's terms. So, the movement invests in a small vanguard, whose job is to, first, raise the public's motivation on the issues, and second, to organize participants' action in a more effective direction. What vanguards don't do is order participants to act. Instead, it makes the public's spontaneous action more likely, more powerful, and more in line with the movement's goals. The final stage is ideological mobilization, exemplified by the Chinese Communist Revolution. This is a low-issue, high-organization grand strategy, in that the movement doesn't expect the public to act spontaneously on the issues. Instead, people are brought into the movement for whatever reason, and only then will an extensive organization politically educate them on the issues. This same organization will also direct all movement actions, acting like a mini-bureaucracy or army ready to pounce on the establishment whenever opportunity beckons. Spontaneous uprising, mass agitation, and ideological mobilization. It's easy to treat them as evolutionary stages in movement grand strategy, and some sociologists do indeed see it that way. But in practice, most successful movements, while focusing on one grand strategy, still contained elements of the other two. This is because each option has its own unique advantage, and anything that might make the formidable task of defeating the establishment easier should probably be pursued. Now that we've discussed social movement strategy at the most abstract level, and the decisions that have to be made within the social movement process, we can now go one level of analysis lower and examine what social movements should prioritize when putting these decisions into practice. Specifically, we'll be focusing on the elements within social movement action. A movement's grand strategy will naturally come with a set of actions that are best suited to that grand strategy. Spontaneous uprisings prioritize actions that get the message out. Ideological mobilizations, on the other hand, should leverage their organizational strength to conduct complex or long-term action. Mass agitations fall somewhere in between, focusing on limited coordinated actions, perhaps like a local strike. We also need to acknowledge that effective actions rely quite a bit on luck and opportunity. Because social movements can't usually match the full strength or longevity of establishments, their success depends on having the right opportunities to exploit, particularly those where the establishment somehow cannot draw on its full power. The best opportunities tend to arise within a broader extended window of opportunity, where the establishment's power has already been on the downtrend for some time. So grand strategy and opportunity structure what actions a movement should pursue and how effective they can be. Within that structure, how can a movement ensure that its actions are as effective as possible? For this, we need to take an abstract concept that we've been using so far, power, and translate it into practical terms. When a movement overpowers the establishment to achieve its political goals, that means one of two things. Either the movement has coerced the establishment by threatening costs on them if they refuse, or the movement has co-opted the establishment by promising benefits to them if they agree. As usual, movements can and have done both things simultaneously. A movement imposes costs on the establishment by disrupting normal routine, upsetting the process of daily life, and forcing the establishment to take steps to restore order. We all know how physical disruption looks like in the form of boycotting or rioting, but disruption can also be non-physical, like how the Me Too movement is forcing a re-examination of what was once accepted as part of work or life. A few movements try and directly target the establishment for disruption, but the vast majority tend to indirectly target the establishment by going after its role as a manager of society, and disrupt the general public instead, in the hopes of forcing the establishment to get involved. An establishment facing disruption has essentially three ways to respond. If it believes that the costs of suppression don't outweigh the costs of giving in, it's likely to try and shut down the movement action. But it can also believe that the costs of the disruption don't outweigh the costs of giving in, in which case it might simply ignore the disruption. What this means for a movement is this. To successfully coerce the establishment to give in, the third option, it's not enough to just convince them that they will pay a heavy price for suppression, which is already an accepted fact in most political systems. Movements also have to convince establishments that giving in is less costly than letting the disruption continue, which is probably the harder task these days, because the disruptive effects of so many traditional actions, protests, riots, boycotts, have been reduced thanks to specialized crowd control, PR, and other such techniques which have been developed for this very purpose. Disruptive actions that are repeated for too long become normalized, and so movements have to constantly innovate and find new pressure points against the establishment. On the other hand, a movement can deliver benefits to the establishment in two major ways. The most obvious one is, of course, political support, but even then, movements have to work to ensure that that support is actually valuable. Hundreds of issues vie for establishment or public attention every day, so a large part of co-opting the establishment is making the movement relevant in the first place. Sometimes, this is about doing something to push your issue up the agenda. Other times, this is about strategically consolidating and positioning the movement as a major voting bloc. A less obvious benefit is policy support. Because establishments have a lot on their plate, they usually like it when experts give them pre-packaged policies that they can adopt and successfully sell to the public. So some movements instead try and present themselves as an authority on their issue field. There are the think tanks and the lobby groups, but the more interesting ones are those movements who get the public to adopt a standard they themselves defined. An example of this is the organic foods movement, who successfully got the public to distinguish between organic and non-organic foods, and so now have become an authority in the realm of genetically modified food labeling, and even within agricultural policy. Whether the goal is on coercion or co-optation, there are several characteristics that good action should have, which are summed up in the sociological acronym of WUNC: worthiness, unity, numbers, commitment. Worthiness used to be defined as respectability, as in social movement participants should demonstrate to the establishment that they are worthy of having their demands met, by, for example, being peaceful and deferential. But even by the end of the 19th century, social movements such as the suffragettes were reinterpreting the meaning of worthiness by engaging in deliberately provocative and undeferential action, a trend that continues to this day with movements such as Black Lives Matter. For them, the worthiness of their demands are self-evident, and action here is more to highlight the hypocrisy involved when the establishment criticizes their action, while upholding the greater injustice that the movement is fighting against. Unity and numbers are self-explanatory, while commitment is about demonstrating the extent and the duration of the sacrifice movement participants are ready to make. This discussion of commitment brings us to the final element that we'll discuss in this video, which is violence. Violence is often seen as a supreme demonstration of the movement's commitment towards disrupting the establishment, and sometimes even as a grand strategic orientation where the movement decides to sacrifice some of its public support in order to boost its power output. On the other hand, as we'll see in the video series, violence can also be used to bolster public participation by shutting down people and organizations who voice contrary opinions. That's assuming that the level of violence is actually something that social movements can dictate, instead of it being a cycle of escalation that is triggered by clashes at the local level. For what is probably the most defining characteristic of action, the effect of violence is probably one of the more ambiguous things within the social movement process. All in all, what we've done here in this brief overview of the elements within a strategy of protest and revolution is to separate out and describe individual aspects within a movement so that viewers can better understand how the process works as a whole, but real life is never as neat as theory, and this is why we still need to analyze actual history. Thank you for watching the video, and please do give a like and subscribe. If you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them in the comments section. Also check out my Facebook page, where I review the literature and post some additional thoughts regarding the video.